Hello, everyone. My name is Layla Bagwell, and I am with the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. I work there as a social change youth activist, and I'm also a TA provider. So today I'll be introducing the wonderful Dana Flightman. So a little bit about Dana today is that she has been with the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center, also known as SPARC, since 2018. In her role as training and awareness specialist, she provides training and technical assistance to multidisciplinary professionals across the country on recognizing and responding to stalking. With a focus on public awareness, Dana also authors original resources, including ready-to-use curricula, discussion guides, and publications on stalking, and leads SPARC's National Stalking Awareness Month efforts each January, designing and creating SPARC's social media campaigns, as well as infographics and videos year-round, really making a difference in the lives of young people. So I'm really excited to introduce Dana to talk to us about stalking in adolescence today.
Great. Thanks so much, Layla, the interpreters, and everyone for joining today. It's wonderful to see different disciplines, different kinds of folks doing great work who joined us from all across the country. So definitely appreciate you. And so, like she said, my name is Dana Flightman. I'm from the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, or SPARC. And today, as you've hopefully deduced, we'll be talking about stalking, particularly as it pertains to adolescents. So, like she said, I do this training all across the country for audiences, including victim advocates, social workers, campus professionals, as well as law enforcement, judicial officers, prosecutors, really anyone on the victim service and or criminal justice side of recognizing and responding to stalking. And I usually start by asking this question, which I'll launch here as a poll. And that's, have you had the chance to attend previous training focused specifically on the topic of stalking? So you can let us know if this is your first one. If you're like, ooh, I think I've been to one or two, or if you're like, ugh, I've been to many of these. I don't know why I'm listening to you, Dana. And of course, there's no one expert on all of stalking. I am not claiming to be that. So please don't hesitate to share your insights, observations, challenges, etc. in the chat anytime. All right, I'm shutting this down in 3, 2, 1. Okay, looks like we split the room a little bit, about a quarter saying, ooh, I've been here before, and about half saying maybe once or twice, and a quarter saying first one. So thanks so much for doing that. Just helpful to get a kind of baseline of where we're at. And I'd say, like I said, I do this training across the country, and typically like a third to the whole room haven't had the chance to attend any stalking training previously. And that's not a reflection of anyone as a professional, but it is a reflection that stalking is very undertrained in our field. And we want to remember there are 4 major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. But it's always kind of like, and stalking. Like, we almost called our website andstalking.org, because so often it's like, oh yeah, and stalking. We kind of cover that too. It's sort of in the mix with the other content that we go over. But the reality is that stalking is a prevalent victimization that stands on its own as something that is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous, as well as a victimization that often intersects with other kinds of violence that we might be more familiar with, like dating violence and sexual violence. And yet when you think about it, there's no national stalking hotline. There are few, if any, standalone stalking crisis services. So it often falls to folks like you who are primarily focused on and often have more resources around intimate partner and sexual violence to kind of add stalking on. And I'm not saying that's fair or easy, because those are already big victimizations with plenty of work to do. But I am saying it's really important because these victims really have nowhere else to go. And so, look, you're the ones on the ground doing the work every day. You know how to do what you do. My hope's just by the end of the session, you move that and stalking a little more to the beginning of the sentence and see the great work that you're already doing through that lens with some new ideas, tools, and resources, especially as it applies to our young victims and survivors. So SPARC is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. And our website, which I'll refer to throughout today's training, is stalkingawareness.org. My colleague Emma is on here as well, and we'll share some links with you in the chat. So thanks in advance, Emma. There we have practitioner guides, and those are broken out by discipline. So we have a section for campus professionals, for victim services, for law enforcement, and so on. I saw some folks in the chat already say they do awareness or prevention education. I think that's really important to integrate stalking into that kind of programming. And so we actually have programs or modules on our website you can pick up and lead with scripts and slides and videos. We have discussion guides on all 4 seasons of the TV show You on Netflix, and other ways to get folks talking stalking without you having to reinvent the wheel. We have victim resources, so we are not a direct service provider, but we know victims come to our website for information. And so we try to provide easy resources that you can share with victims. For example, these brochures are free on our website in English and Spanish on understanding stalking. You can put your local information here. So if you have something to hand your survivor of intimate partner or sexual violence, make sure you have something for your stalking survivor as well. We also have fact sheets, infographics, including one specifically on stalking in adolescents, as well as tips for helping friends and other resources that might be helpful, and webinar. So if after today you're like, I wish I could hear Dana talk even more, you are in luck, my friends, because we have an archive of recorded webinars, and we're called SPARC. So I got us to call it the SPARchives. So that was like the height of my career. So you can check us out on the SPARchives anytime. We're also on social media. Our handle on there is at Follow Us Legally if you get our sick sense of humor at SPARC, and sign up for our newsletter. As an anti-stalking organization, we will not contact you excessively or without your consent. So you have to actually opt into our newsletter, and it's one we send around quarterly. It's not one of those you're getting all the time. So I really hope that you do connect with us to keep stalking top of mind year round. All right, so why learn about stalking? Well, stalking is a really important thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is a crime. It's a crime at the federal level in all 50 states and all US territories, on most tribal lands, and in the military justice system. It also often falls under Title IX in our K through 12 spaces. So it is a crime or a conduct violation pretty much across the board. And stalking is traumatic. Many stalking victims experience mental health and physical health issues. Those mental health issues in particular often include post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, insomnia, depression. And if you think about what's a little bit unique to stalking is that sense of anticipatory fear, that sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. We have stalking victims feel like that sometimes for years. So you can imagine the kind of toll that would take psychologically and the kind of hypervigilance that often results. And studies found that for adolescents, especially, or maybe not especially, but in particular, even when they controlled for other traumatic events, stalking was something that uniquely impacted their mental health. Many lose time from work. So if they haven't, many stalking victims lose some time. About half of those lose 5 days or more, and quite a few relocate. This really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Even if you're excited about it and it's a positive development in your life, it's expensive, it's stressful. It's not something you do when someone's kind of annoying you. We have 1 in 7 victims relocating, and certainly many cases of their families relocating when we have our teen victims. To get away from these offenders. And so I think that helps to illustrate how consuming and traumatic this can be. And stalking is dangerous. It often occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including but not limited to rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to directly harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicides, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking. the year prior to that homicide or attempted homicide. And yet, so often these stalking behaviors are dismissed, especially when they're happening among our younger folks, as, oh, it's just texting, it's following, they're still figuring things out, it's a tough breakup, it's annoying, but no one's really getting hurt here. And that's simply not true. In fact, this wonderful researcher we work with, Patrick Brady, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. These behaviors and tactics adding up and escalating over time. Now, I'm not saying every stalking case escalates to the point of homicide or violence, right? That's not accurate. What I am saying is that every week I read cases of homicide, attempted homicide, violence, attempted violence. And at that point, responders are looking backwards and saying, oh, look, there's this whole history of stalking victimization here. Often that was reported to multiple sources, but was not handled with the urgency needed. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to wait for violence and look back and say, oh, turns out there was stalking this whole time. No, we want to identify the stalking while it's happening and intervene then, because this is one of the few crimes where early identification and intervention can help prevent further trauma, violence, possibly even homicide. And so we really have an opportunity here to make a difference for adolescents and for all victims and survivors of stalking. Yet it's quite underreported, right? So similar to intimate partner and sexual violence, we know most victims don't report. Fewer than a third of stalking victims report to law enforcement. Even fewer than that seek out victim services. And we don't have a great study around adolescent reporting in particular. So you'll see me cite campus studies because that's the closest thing we have quite a bit of the time. But the numbers are similar there. Fewer than a third of students seeking out any kind of support on campus. So if you can tell me in the chat, why do you think that is? Why would our adolescents not call law enforcement or even go to maybe their guidance counselor on campus or at school the moment that they're thinking, I'm getting kind of freaked out here? Why not report? Fear of retaliation, absolutely. We know that if that report is made, if they're going to get that person in trouble, that stalker might escalate their behavior. Absolutely. So they might be very afraid of that happening. If they get that call to knock it off, that no contact or protective order, right? Absolutely. Mandatory reporting laws. Yeah, they're very confusing for students to know who's confidential and who is not. And they may not want to lose control of the situation by setting off a process that they don't want to be happening. A few of these, yeah, afraid they're overreacting, don't want to be seen as dramatic. Absolutely. I'd say not uniquely, but maybe especially with our teens and young adults, there's a sense of, well, I'm basically an adult. I can handle it. I don't want to make it a big thing. And because of the messages they've received, this maybe I am overreacting, or maybe they didn't mean it that way, right? Or I should be flattered. I don't know. I'm the one who's being weird about it, giving that stalker the benefit of the doubt. Fear of not being believed or taken seriously. Absolutely. Feeling like they'll be told you're making this up, you're exaggerating, or that you can't prove it, right? And with stalking in particular, we often want our victims to come with like a documentation log and a bunch of evidence. And yeah, that's helpful. We have one on our website. Great to see, but quite burdensome and not intuitive for our victims. And so they might feel like, yeah, this happens, but I can't prove it. So what's the point, right? I'm not going to be believed and I don't have amazing evidence. Not wanting to get someone in trouble. I think absolutely. We know that most victims and stalkers know each other. And I think as adults, we feel social pressure, absolutely. But when you really think about a high school context, that's really a world within a world. That social scene is your whole life. You have to go there every day, right? And so the stakes of that are very high to socially try to stay away from somebody or to create a division or get someone in trouble, right? That's really, they might feel bad for the person, but also they may not want to rock the boat. No trust in law enforcement. Yeah, they may have had a bad experience or have a friend who had, don't feel authority is the way to go. They don't know who to report to. Yeah, that's a great one. I think absolutely, like, who do I tell about this? Most people don't know stalking's a crime and then think, well, I'll call law enforcement about it. So they may not know who to even talk to about it. Um, Oh, yeah, and victim blaming responses that might have turned the victim off to seeking further help, right? Like just being told, we'll just block them or something like that, as well as the normalization and romanticization of stalking, right? So seeing those behaviors shown in our media often as romantic and desirable, and then saying, well, I'm feeling uncomfortable, but I don't trust my instinct because I'm supposed to like this, right? So yeah, for all those reasons, we see that our victims don't report, and more. And while we can't resolve all of those dynamics and issues, by being a source of accurate information about stalking, by providing stalking services, by letting people know where to find those services, we can at least help close some of that gap in reporting. When we look at our victim services, even fewer victims seek out victim services than go to law enforcement, and quite a few who seek them out don't receive any, right? And so I think that's also that piece of not knowing what door to walk into. It's not very intuitive for most teens to go to, say, the Family Violence Center, even if they're experiencing dating violence, because that's not their family. Now let's remove that one more if they're being stalked by, say, an estranged friend and there was never a romantic relationship. It's not particularly intuitive where those victim advocates would be housed. But it's okay. We're going to fix it today by providing more information, more resources, and better incorporating stalking education and response into our work with young people. So I'm saying stalking's so bad, we have to do something. What is it exactly? Well, depends who we ask. There's your behavioral definition and your statute. Every state and territory has a different statute to make it fun. And I definitely suggest looking yours up because they can vary quite a bit. And it's helpful to be able to explain to students that what's happening on campus might be adjudicated in a different way than what might happen if they took this through, say, the criminal justice process. So definitely encourage you to look at that. Today, we're focusing on the behavioral definition because this better informs school policies, and this is really what stalking is and what stalking looks like behaviorally. So I have these three scenarios for you, and all of these are bummers, okay? We don't like any of them. But which of them are stalking? It could be all of them, some of them, none of them. So I'm going to launch each as a poll and ask you to vote. So the first one, student peeks into the girls' locker room to watch the girls undress. Does that sound like stalking to you? Yes or no? All right, I'm going to shut it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Looks like most folks saying no, but about a third saying, yeah, that sounds like it could be stalking. Okay, how about this next scenario where you have an ex-partner repeatedly spreading vicious rumors about their former partner on social media? Does that sound like stalking to you? Okay, I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, also split the room but the opposite way. About 2/3 saying yes, about a third saying no. Okay, and last but not least, um, we have this college advisor who's out of control. They're asking their student mentee invasive questions, sending emails at weird hours, being verbally abusive when that student doesn't respond right away. Does that sound like stalking to you? All right, shutting it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so there we have most folks saying yes and a few saying no. All right, well, thanks for thinking through that. I'm sure some things came up for you, like, well, how many times did this happen? Or how did the student feel about it? And so I'm going to go through the behavioral definition here and use these examples to help answer those questions. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others, or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So to break that down a little bit more, it is a pattern of behavior. That's not a single incident or a one-off event, and that's called a course of conduct in most statutes and policies. So you might hear me use those terms kind of interchangeably today: pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm talking about the same thing. It's 2 or more behaviors that make up that pattern. In a few jurisdictions, it's 3 or more, but behaviorally, most places, 2 or more. And those behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking you because I'm the worst presenter ever. Okay. So maybe Monday I text you. Tuesday I'm mad you didn't respond. I smash your headlights. Wednesday I feel kind of bad about that. So I leave you some flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors, right? So stalkers often combine behaviors that are criminal on their own, like that property damage, with other behaviors that may not be crimes on their own, but can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. And so I encourage you, whenever a victim is telling you about an upsetting incident, to really zoom out and be thinking, is this an isolated incident, or is it part of a bigger pattern of behavior? Because that student who's telling you about, say, their smashed headlight may or may not think to automatically disclose, oh, I think I know who did this, and they've been texting me a lot. And my phone's acting weird. I think they hacked into something. And they've been leaving me weird gifts, right? They may or may not just automatically share that because that's not relevant. That's not what we're talking about. But it needs to be, because it's letting you know this is not an isolated incident. It is part of a bigger pattern of behavior. And those behaviors, again, often combine things that are crimes on their own and other behaviors that aren't. So that's confusing because our system tends to be pretty incident based. And so we really have to zoom out and get that bigger picture. So it's a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person or persons. So if we have a student peering into the girls' locker room to look at whoever happened to be there, that might still be a crime and or conduct violation, but that's not really stalking because stalking's directed at a specific person. Now, that being said, it could totally become stalking. Let's say they identify a certain girl, follow her out of the room, and then contact her, right? Okay, now it is directed at someone specific, and we have 2 or more incidents. And so it could become stalking, but that on its own wouldn't really be stalking. That being said, we often see what we call target dispersion, which is maybe you have let's say you have a friend stalking an estranged friend. They had a big falling out. And then that victim makes a new friend. And now they're trying to ruin that new relationship, right? And so they're stalking their ex-friend and the ex-friend's new buddy, right? And we see that all the time where our stalkers are trying to get access to and information about their victims. So they're likely to reach out to the victim's family, friends, coworkers, teammates, teachers, coaches, really anyone who has a connection to that victim. So a lot of folks can be involved and even considered co-victimized in a stalking case, but we still see that behaviorally is directed at a specific person because the stalker's trying to get to that victim and they might use other people to do it. And in the social landscape of many high schools, it's quite easy to do that, right? To use third parties to get that information. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really important to understanding stalking. And it's what separates it, and I'm talking behaviorally here, from a behavior it's often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is typically that behavior that would make someone feel frustrated, angry, annoyed, disrespected, create a hostile environment. And harassment can be quite serious. I'm not trying to minimize it, but it's not necessarily scary. The difference there is really fear. So if I'm a student and my college advisor is emailing me at 2 a.m. and then yelling at me in front of my peers in the morning and like just keeps asking me questions, okay, that's weird and I'm being disrespected and this person is not practicing normal, appropriate boundaries, right? I'm not necessarily afraid of them. I'm just like, wow, this person's being very disrespectful to me. Um, but I can still more or less live a normal life. But let's say then I'm driving home from school. I think I see their car a couple back. They text me a picture of myself walking my pug saying, why are you doing that instead of your homework? They email my mom. I don't even know how they got her email. Like now I'm scared, right? Because I'm like, wow, this person's very fixated on me. Where in my life can I get away from this person? Are they going to hurt me? Like, what do they want me to do? And so harassment can kind of become stalking or be part of a stalking course of conduct, but they're a little bit distinct. And the difference is that level of fear. If there's fear, especially fear of violence, we're probably looking at stalking versus harassment. Um, so of the three scenarios, I'd say the most likely to be stalking would be that middle one, an ex-partner spreading vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. And you may be thinking, well, people gossip, that's not necessarily scary. And you're right. But when we talk about fear and stalking, it's fear of bodily harm as well as emotional distress. So emotional distress is also about fear, but it's recognizing that people may be afraid of outcomes other than physical harm. Like for our older victims, it might be being afraid of losing custody of your children, or it might be being afraid of never having a moment alone again, right? And so people experiencing emotional distress, it's not just being frustrated or annoyed or having a bad day. They feel that they're under surveillance, that they're being intimidated, sabotaged, um, and threatened. And they feel that they often feel they cannot get away from that offender. The best quote that I saw about it was the victim who said, "It's like he's taken my life without killing me." So that sense that I cannot have a normal life because of the interference from the offender. And so when we think about spreading rumors and kind of those social consequences, yeah, it would depend on the situation. But we've had some really vicious and emotionally distressing rumor cases, right? So, for example, there was a case where a victim was applying to jobs. And so she was, writing cover letters and emailing. And the offender had photoshopped some nude images of this victim and was also watching her email. So every time she emailed a potential employer, he would send these images and lies about her sexual preferences to the potential employer at HR. And then he'd go on LinkedIn and find everyone else who worked there and send it to them as well. So that's beyond like, oh, people gossip, right? That's really sabotaging this victim. And it's scary because she can't get a job. She can't move her life forward. And she's being approached in a sexual way by strangers and doesn't know why. So it's scary and it's really sabotaging her day-to-day life, right? And so we often see that, and especially that non-consensual image sharing is a significant problem, especially in this age group. And so again, stalking is about fear, but fear is tough because fear is very personal, right? Like what's scary to me may not be scary to you and vice versa. So we're going to watch, this is literally a 5-second video, and think about which of these folks you identify with more. Yep, that's it. Um, so some of you might have felt like the lady in this video, in which case, I'm sorry I did this to you. Um, but a lot of you might be resonating more with the space left here on the screen. That's like, what is your problem, lady? Can you calm down? And we can understand where this guy's coming from, right? But what if I told you the same woman was bit by a spider last year, had a terrible allergic reaction, went to the hospital, and almost died? We still be making the space at her? Hopefully not. Because what did I give you there? Context, information, the backstory. And context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases because a lot of times what's scariest and most threatening to a victim may seem benign or even kind of nice to an outsider. For example, this was a case where the victim did call the police, and honestly, she was hysterical. She's yelling, she's screaming, she's crying, and all she'd say was, "There's a cup of coffee in my car." So, understandably, the police are not sending out the SWAT team. They're kind of like, "Okay, lady." And eventually she calmed down and said, "He's here." So it turned out this was a stalking offender that she had relocated to get away from, address confidentiality, new job, really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that day. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So I can't see you since we're on webinar. When I tell that story in person, typically people go like, ugh, right? And what that tells me is a reasonable person would feel fear. It's really scary if we know the whole context of the situation. But if all we see is this object of a cup of coffee, we're like, dude, I wish my car did that. These kids today have it all, right? Like we don't understand what the problem is. And so something may be scary to the victim, but not to you as the responder. And so what you want to do is respectfully ask them some follow-up questions. Ask questions like, what message did that send to you? What is the story behind that? Because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic, albeit an extreme example, is an offender saying something like, "I'll send you roses the day I kill you." Right? So the victim gets flowers and is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, "Oh, that's so lovely," because they don't know about that specific meaning. And so it's context that makes stalking scary, and it's context that makes stalking stalking, because generally no one thing is stalking. It's all the behaviors adding up and escalating over time. And it's not criminal to send someone flowers. It generally is criminal to make a credible threat to kill somebody. So when one means the other, we have to do a little digging to be able to explain that, because this is how stalkers get away with their behaviors. They send these threats that our victims receive loud and clear, but without more context, they just don't make sense and we don't see the urgency there. The reality is, if a victim's afraid or in distress, they probably know something we don't. So we're going to watch the next few seconds of this video and see how it plays out. All right, so obviously a silly video, but we don't want to be that guy, right? And this happens in our stalking cases all the time. We have a victim in a lot of fear and a responder saying, "It's not that big a deal, you're overreacting." When who was on point the whole time? It was our victim, right? There is no better risk assessment than a victim's own fear. So if the person you're working with is afraid or in distress, even if it doesn't make a ton of sense to you at first, they probably know something you don't. But is it fear? So in that video, we can tell that lady's scared because she's jumping and screaming. But as you already know from your work with young people and people of all ages for that matter, that's not always how they appear, even if they are afraid. It's really quite a vulnerable thing to say, "I feel scared." We're much more likely to mask that under something else, like, "I'm frustrated, I'm annoyed, I'm worried about," right? And most teens are not going to use the word fear or stalking. They're more likely to say something like, "My ex is being creepy. My coach is making things awkward. An old friend is harassing me," right? My uncle's being weird. And it's up to us to be thinking, could this be fear? Could this be stalking? There's also a lot of minimization that we know our young people do because of the messages they've received, where they might say, oh, no, it's fine that they're in all my accounts and they watch me all the time. As long as they don't bother, my mom, right? You can kind of take a step back and be like, is it fine? Or have you normalized um, abnormal behaviors because of repeated trauma, right? Um, a helpful way to assess for fear is ask victims what they've changed as a result of the victimization. Because I've had victims say, I'm not afraid of them or anything. Like, it's really just annoying. But I changed my routes to and from school. I don't go anywhere alone anymore. I always go with some friends. I turn my location off. I block them on Snapchat. Oh, and I asked my mom if we could get one of those like Ring doorbells just in case. Okay, so those aren't things you do when someone's kind of annoying you, right? That indicates a higher level of fear and distress. And so ask victims about these changes, or if there are things that as teens they can't control, their attempt to make these changes, or perhaps they, petition like their parents to buy something, right? So changes to accounts, numbers, and settings. They changed their passwords, they blocked somebody, they turned their location off, they stopped using a certain application or network. Finances on devices or accommodations, those could be things like, again, buying, asking to change the locks, or buying a Ring doorbell or a Nest Cam or something like that. Or other security systems, as well as, I was going to stay with my friend and they were parked outside the house. And so we both went to a motel instead, and here's the receipt. Increased security and privacy measures, often third parties can corroborate those, right? So those could include any of the things I just mentioned, as well as, oh, I asked the coach to not put me in any pictures that they, post on social. I asked my internship to take my photo off the website. I have changed my routes to and from school, or even between classes when I'm at school. I stopped participating in, a certain sport because they would often show up at the games. I stopped hanging out with that person, right? And financial impacts, and I'd add academic impacts as well. If they're feeling unsafe at school and that they can't go to class, so now they're started missing school. Or financial impacts, like, they slashed my tires and I had to, work and get them fixed. All of that, we can see how that would be distressing. One challenge, so that's our behavioral definition. One challenge, especially, though not only at this age group, is differentiating stalking from romantic pursuit and or bullying. And there's no clear demarcation here where one's definitely one and one's definitely the other. Um, if we look at the definition of bullying, it's unwanted aggressive behavior. There's a power imbalance. The behavior is repeated. And so if you think about the stalking definition, it's pretty similar. It's okay, this says aggressive behavior. We know it's stalking's unwanted or scary behavior. There's a power imbalance. Well, yeah, we can certainly apply a power and control framework to a lot of our stalking cases. And it's repeated. It happens more than once. Some of the examples of bullying that were listed on the website focusing on this include examples that are often stalking behaviors, right? So socially, that might be sexual comments, taunting, or threatening. Verbally, that could be spreading rumors, embarrassing them in public. Leaving someone out is probably the only one that's likely not stalking, right? Because that's what victims want. They want their stalkers to leave them alone, as well as physical violence, which we often see in our stalking cases. And so I bring this up not because I have an amazing answer for you around what is bullying versus stalking, but I do think it's worth noting that stalking is a criminal behavior. And in all the bullying education that I've personally seen, I rarely see the word stalking mentioned. And I think that it needs to be introduced in part of the conversation because that is a criminal offense. And we know that some teens stalk because of bullying and retaliation, right? They are engaging in stalking behaviors as part of their bullying conduct, essentially. And there is that challenge of differentiating between them. And so my hope would be that the word stalking is introduced in those conversations and spaces, and that we're thinking about, obviously, we want to address bullying in its own right, but when does that maybe cross a line into stalking? And what are the tools at our disposal to help keep those victims safe and hold those offenders accountable? There's also a challenge between, on the other side of things, developmentally appropriate pursuit behavior, right? That romantic pursuit and stalking, because we know that romantic pursuit looks different for our younger folks than it does for older folks, right? So, if we have a teen writing their crush's name in a notebook 100 times, that's fine. We have a 40-year-old doing it. We're like, what's going on, team? Right? We don't like that now. Now it's not fine. And so we know that the intensity of teen relationships, especially those early romantic relationships, is a lot. And if you think back to your first crush or your first breakup, are you happy with the way you handled that? I know I'm not, right? There is a lot of intensity there. And so we can't necessarily say, well, I wouldn't act like that in my adult relationship, therefore no teen should do that. But it is a continuum from developmentally appropriate intensity to stalking. And again, no amazing clear line here, but I think the real indicator is that most teens don't experience developmentally appropriate behavior as scary. They might experience it as, oh, I don't love that, or it's unwanted, or it's awkward. But if they're scared because of the repeated attempts to pursue them, we might be looking at a stalking situation. And so when we look at appropriate behaviors, yeah, that intense, crushed romantic feelings, they might present small gifts, follow around school, talk to them all the time. They're waiting at the locker. They're doing an elaborate promposal, those kinds of things, as well as idolizing celebrity figures, right? So that could be, they have a big, like for me, it was a big Backstreet Boys poster in my room, right? So we know that's normal because I did it. So obviously it was fine. But, idolizing celebrity figures in a way that older adults, might be a fan, but maybe don't have like a ton of imagery and know everything about that person. Um, but that's pretty common with our younger fans. And again, these behaviors are rarely experienced as threatening unless they are threatening, right? And it's again, that context is really key here. And so when we're thinking about these different kind of behaviors in this age group, we want to be thinking, when does this become unreasonable? When does it become criminal? And of course, it's contextual and every situation is different. But again, I encourage you to introduce the idea of stalking into those conversations and be thinking about that as a possibility as well. In terms of prevalence, stalking is a very prevalent victimization. In the United States, nearly 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience stalking in their lifetimes. We know stalking impacts people of all gender identities, absolutely. This is the best available national data. That's why I'm repeating it to you this way. So if you're familiar with the prevalence around intimate partner or sexual violence, it's quite similar. And yet stalking is not often part of that conversation. And we know this is happening early for a lot of our victims and survivors, unfortunately. Now, I grant you, it's hard to get good data that's national in scope around minors, right? And so this one's from NISVS, but a lot of the data comes from smaller studies. And I'll try to point that out along the way. But here it asked adults, when were you first stalked, right? And so over half are saying before 25. And a quarter of our female victims and nearly 1 in 5 of our male victims, it's under 18, right? And so that's a lot to say that about 20 to 24% of our stalking victims are first being stalked in these child or teen years. right? And so we know this is an issue that our young people experience that is happening early, and it might recur. They might have a different stalker later, or the same offender might stick around. Again, we know people of all genders experience stalking, absolutely. Women are more likely than men to experience it, and the majority of victims report that the offender's male. That's true regardless of the victim's sexual orientation. Um, and so sometimes that's an extension of power and control where men are stalking other men, right? Maybe it's a same-sex relationship. We also see a lot of target dispersion, which is, say you have an ex-boyfriend stalking his ex-girlfriend. She starts hanging out with a new guy. Okay, now he's stalking the new guy as well. That's not all men stalking other men, but that is a significant piece of it. So when I look for pictures of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, okay, this is the kind of stuff I get. So as you can see, a lot of shadowy figures. I think these look like strangers, kind of creepers in the alley, faceless men, etc. Right? And especially this guy in the middle left wearing a mask and a hoodie and behind a computer. And so I know it won't surprise you at all who are on this call today to know that this is not accurate, right? That actually, usually victims know stalkers, stalkers know victims. So I know you know that. The reason I bring this up is because most people do not know that, right? When I'm talking about stalking outside of our field, because I'm fun at parties and stuff, okay? People are shocked by this because when most people think stalking, this is what they're thinking of. They're thinking about a random stranger, or they might be thinking about an obsessed fan stalking a celebrity because that's where a lot of our stalking news is. And especially if you have teens who are interested in a certain celebrity or celebrity culture, a lot of those celebrities have spoken about their stalkers who tend to be really delusional, right, and don't know them. Or they might be thinking of like a secret admirer sending a ransom style note because we see that on TV a lot, especially in teen dramas, honestly. And all those things can and do happen, right? But they're by far the minority of cases. So the challenge is you have victims saying things like, oh, that's not a stalker. That's just my ex having a hard time getting over things. Well, again, surprising zero people here, that's a major category of stalking offender. So this is for all adults, not just teens. Um, or for all adults, actually, excluding teens because they weren't in the study. But, so if we look at the overall population numbers, about a third of the time for our male victims, about 40% of the time for our female victims, that stalker is a current or former intimate partner. So that's a big piece of it, right? That intimate partner violence for our teens, it would most likely be dating violence situation, 30–40%. But that also means that 60 to 70% of the time, it's not an intimate partner. It's not dating violence, right? It might be an acquaintance. It could be a stranger, though it's relatively rare. It might be a brief encounter, like, oh, I think they work at that coffee shop near me, or I think they were on the other team and I saw them at a meet or something. Um, it could be a family member or a person of authority. That could be a teacher, a coach, an academic advisor, a supervisor, or like a law enforcement or immigration officer, someone with some power over the victim. This is, I think, the largest study around adolescent stalking. And it found the categories are a little bit different, but fairly similar results in that it's that current or former partner about 40% of the time. Um, about a quarter of the time, someone I know not from school. So they don't go here, but I know them. About the same, I know them and they're here, right? Maybe they're in my classes, they go here somewhere. And then 12% a friend or a strange friend. And here the stranger numbers were negligible. And so again, that intimate partner dating violence intersection piece is significant, but it's not the whole story. And so I really encourage you to think about in your stalking education and response, are you reaching and serving all victims of stalking, intimate partner and non-intimate partner? If you're not, do you know where to refer them? And if you are, do they know how to find you? Because again, if I'm being stalked by, say, an estranged friend, we had a falling out, and now she's stalking me and there is never a sexual relationship, it's not very intuitive to me to go to the family violence center, even if they have a great teen outreach program, because that's, I'm not experiencing the dating violence piece, but that's where the folks like you often are who can help, right? The victim advocates who can help me. And so we have a checklist of fun questions to think about how you're incorporating stalking into your work. We have one for campus professionals, and that's college campus focused, but much of it applies to that K through 12 environment as well as for domestic and sexual violence organizations. And some of these are pretty low hanging fruit, like, is the word stalking on your website? Um, if you're doing awareness education on healthy relationships and bystander intervention, do you mention stalking or do a training on stalking as well? Is stalking part of your mission statement if it's part of your mission? And then some of them are harder, right? Like, is your staff trained on stalking? Um, are shelters that you partner with accepting of non-intimate partner stalking victims who might need to come into shelter? And so I encourage you to, be the most popular person at your next staff meeting, and go through these and just think about your response and opportunities to enhance it. So there are so many stalking behaviors. We certainly don't have time to talk about them all, though feel free to add in the chat any that you've seen. One common stalking behavior is to break into a victim's vehicle or residence and not take or break anything, but just leave some sign they've been there. So maybe they leave a can of soda. That's the brand the victim knows that stalker likes to drink. Or they move a lamp they one time argued about where it looked better in the room. Or they turn the TV on a channel they used to watch together. And so the victim gets, let's say, home. They know that offender's been there. But they're like, what am I going to do? Call the police or even tell my parents that so-and-so moved a lamp? I'm going to sound crazy. And offenders know that. That's why they engage in this behavior. In fact, 1 in 5 victims of stalking reported that exact thing. Offender breaking into home or vehicle and leaving some sign they had done so. So if a victim ever says to you, I know it sounds crazy, but that's a red flag that this might be a stalking case. Just tell law enforcement, I'm not saying don't investigate it, but I'm saying let's investigate it. If you have a victim saying I'm hearing voices, well, it's pretty easy to drop in on an Alexa or Google Home or to talk to someone through a variety of microphone apps. And while we don't have time for a deep dive into the use of technology today, we know that our teens are digital natives, right? Using technology in inventive ways that we may not be aware of or have thought of ourselves. And so if they're saying this is happening, we want to take that seriously and really, really go from there. These are the major categories of stalking behavior, and I think they overlap and intersect for sure. But it's helpful to just think of them to kind of expand our thinking on stalking, because when a lot of folks think stalking, they think surveillance. So you often get the imagery of like binoculars or a camera, or we've heard a lot about property tags in the news, right? And that is a part of a lot of stalking cases, but it's not the only thing, because anything scary that's not the first thing that's happened could be a stalking case. And that's a whole variety of behaviors. So I'm going to go through some of the most common ones here. And of course, again, feel free to share in the chat as well. Surveillance is, how is the stalker watching, following, gathering information about that victim? That could be in person, that watching, waiting, driving by, walking by, showing up, as well as through technology, hacking into accounts, demanding passwords, planting a camera or accessing a camera, seeing what they do on social media. And it's important to remember that most, not all, but most stalkers who use technology are also stalking in person. And so, yes, knowing about technology facilitated stalking is important. And it's often not the whole picture, right? Because a lot of these stalkers are also engaging in in-person pursuit. We also see a lot of proxy stalking, which is a fancy way of saying stalking through third parties. And so sometimes it's that mutual acquaintance who doesn't know they're helping a stalker. Oh, are they going to go stay with their mom for Mother's Day this year? Do you know if their family's going on that vacation for Christmas they talked about? Did you see them at the mall, right? Um, and then sometimes that person doesn't know they're helping, and sometimes they totally do. So we might have an offender, and we have offenders even when incarcerated sending third parties, hey, I'll get in trouble or they don't want to talk to me, but you go check up on them for me. Tell me if they're seeing someone new, or they blocked me on social, but you're friends with them, so can you check on these different things, right? And so they're using third parties to get that information. Life invasions, how are they showing up in the victim's life where the victim doesn't want them to be there? So we see that through that unwanted contact, right? Most of us are pretty plugged in all day, or charged up anyways. I guess we don't have to plug in that much anymore. And so often there's that unwanted contact across applications, across devices, right? They're texting, they're calling, they're leaving voicemails, they're on Snapchat, they're on WhatsApp, they're on Facebook, they're direct messaging, they're commenting, they're emailing, just trying to get you, trying to get you, trying to get to you. Showing up, and at high schools, there's a lot of opportunities to do that, right? So there's a lot of that, like, since when did you decide to join the marching band, right? Since when are you in mock trial, right? But now they're just showing up in these public or semi-public or open events or clubs. Or, since when do you watch my soccer practice when I told you I don't want you to, right? They just keep showing up. Property invasion, I mentioned, that public humiliation and spreading rumors, we see how that can happen in person and or through technology, especially if your target is kind of a closed community, right? To spread those rumors. Um, and harassing friends and family. So many victims say, hey, when it was just me, it was fine. But now that they're calling, my brother, my sister, my new partner, my friends, my mom, like, that's really not okay. And so we do see that as well. Intimidation, explicitly or implicitly, how is that offender threatening that victim? Those could be those direct threats, and those threats could be physical harm, as well as, if you don't XYZ, I will release that photo, or I will tell everyone that thing that you told me in privacy, right? Could also be symbolic violence. Like, we had a case where an offender kept breaking into the victim's home and slicing her underwear with a knife. So that kind of symbolic sexual violence, or punching a hole in the wall, slashing a tire. Threats to harm oneself, that's really scary for our victims, who often feel some level of connection and responsibility for the welfare of the stalker. Or threats to the victim about harming others, family, friends, pets, etc. All of that's really scary to our victims. In addition to forced confrontations, right? Well, there's one way out of school and they're standing in front of it. Like, what am I going to do? I don't want to go through them to get to my car, or to get to where my parents are picking me up, right? And so we just need to remember that someone can be intimidating without saying a word. And interference through sabotage or attack, what's actually changing for that victim. That could be financial, work, or academic sabotage, um, keeping them from leaving, road rage, harming them physically or harming others physically, property damage, very concrete interference, right? They slashed my tire, now I can't get to practice. Um, literally taking their homework or their means to do that, disconnecting their internet, right? Anything that's really sabotaging that person or harming them. And so again, that's a short list, right? There's a lot of them. But if you're trying to figure out, do I think this teen's being stalked, or what's going on here based on what they're describing? If you ask them, are you being stalked? They're likely to say, well, no, it's not stalking. Come on now. But if you ask these more specific questions, you're likely to get more information. So ask about these categories. Have they tracked, followed, or monitored you in any way? Have they invaded your life or privacy with unwanted contact? And give some examples. I'll go back to this. Oh, no, I lied to you. Okay. Sorry. Give some examples of what that looks like, right? And so they might say, I don't know if they've invaded my life, but oh yeah, they text me all the time. Look, they're texting me right now, right? So give some examples of what that might be. And Emma, if you could put the checklist tool that I thought was in here in the chat, it gives some good examples to kind of go from as well that are more concrete. If they say yes to any of these, Were you afraid or concerned for your safety? Did you make life changes for those safety reasons, right? Those accommodations I mentioned earlier. And were you worried about financial, social, or here I'd add academic impact, right? That speaks more to that emotional distress. And this can help you determine if stalking's happening. If you like those questions, there's a longer version, which I highly, highly recommend for victims of all ages. It's free, it's online. It's called SHARP, the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile. And it creates a narrative report that really chunks out and summarizes the totality of the situation. And so here's just kind of a screenshot from one. It's short, it takes about 10-15 minutes. Asks, hey, has this happened? Are we feeling like this? Has this been going on? And then it's looking for 14 risk factors and will let you know. We see, 8 out of 14, 12 out of 14, etc., and what they are and why. So this can be a really helpful way to get the full scope of the course of conduct, as well as to help tell the story of what's going on in a way that makes sense to the person listening. Because there's a lot of stalking behaviors, there's also a lot of potential crimes and or student policy violations that your offender might commit in their course of conduct. And so one thing that we always say to law enforcement is like, if you can't charge stalking, charge something, right? Because if on day one you have, say, trespassing, and on day two you have voyeurism, I'm not your judge, but according to me, Judge Dana, you now have 2 or more behaviors that would cause fear, right? You have a stalking case. But if we didn't do anything with that trespassing, because we're like, oh, yeah, they don't go to the school, but whatever. People come here all the time. Now we don't have a stalking case because we're starting with 1 instead of 2. And same, think about your student conduct code. If there's anything that your students had to sign to use the Wi-Fi at school, did they have to sign something saying they won't be terrible? But then they use it and do cyberbullying? Okay, maybe that's check mark 1, right? Let's have accountability for something, even if we can't for everything, and also build up that course of conduct. Most stalkers use more than one means of approach. 2/3 of stalkers pursue their victims at least once a week. Many pursue daily. And the average duration of a stalking case, this really shocked me when I learned this, not the high end. The average duration is 2 years, and 10% of cases last 5 years or more. And so a stalking case can last from one afternoon to an entire lifetime. There's a huge variety there. But for a lot of our cases, our stalkers have time to change their tactics. So when you're assessing risk and safety planning with your stalking victim, no, you can't read the future. But as much as possible, you want to be thoughtful about what access or information does this offender have about this victim, and what might they do next. Because just because they haven't shown up at, say, the home doesn't mean they won't. So let's make sure you have a safe place to go and a bag packed and maybe a camera so we could catch them coming. So again, to think again as much as possible. So I'm going to just quickly talk here about some of the co-victimizations. And we have more information about this on our website. I already mentioned about 30-40% of the time that stalker is an intimate partner. So let's focus in on that segment here. If we look at our friend, the power and control wheel, of course, this is showing different ways that an abuser might use power to control their victim. I show you this because often in our field, if I hear about stalking at all, it's usually like this. They'll say, okay, it was an abusive relationship. The victim left. And from the day that victim left, our abuser began stalking them. Sometimes with teens, I hear it called breakup violence, right? It's a bad breakup and they just can't let it go. And now they're stalking them. And that can totally happen, right? But let's take it back a step. If during our relationship, the abuser was following them around, texting them constantly, demanding check-ins, looking at all their personal info, showing up, damaging their property, threatening them, that's stalking, right? It's intimate partner violence. It's what we might call emotional abuse or digital abuse or coercive control. And it's stalking. It's both. And that can happen during or after a relationship. Over half the time, it's happening during the relationship as well, but folks often don't call it stalking then. They call it emotional abuse, digital abuse. And it is those things, but it's also stalking. We want to know when stalking is happening at any point in an abusive relationship because, on average, our intimate partner stalkers are the most threatening and violent. And we know this is happening with our teens. Nearly half of teens with dating experience said that they either experienced and or perpetrated stalking behaviors. Either they did this to their partner or their partner did this to them, right? Not necessarily only after the relationship ended. And so when you're talking about healthy relationship education and consent with young folks, you also want to introduce the idea that boundaries are not only physical, there's also boundaries around time and privacy, right? And how much attention somebody gets. And how do we set those boundaries and communicate them and trust our instincts when they're being violated? Because often this is part of a teen relationship, and we don't want it to be, right? We want people to be trusting their instincts and setting boundaries. All stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely. Generally, the more someone knows or knew about the victim, the more dangerous they tend to be. So if we have an acquaintance that say they were best friends, family friends, travel together, went on vacation together, and then have a huge falling out, that they have a lot of access and information. So I would put that level of risk closer to an intimate partner than an acquaintance that's like, oh yeah, I met them at, I don't know, a speech and debate tournament one time, right? Um, and so you want to ask, it's always individual. And also, intimate partner is not a term anyone uses besides us, right? No teen is like, you have to meet my new intimate partner. They're so dreamy, right? That's not a thing. And so it might be a relationship that's like, oh, we're mostly friends, but we hooked up a couple times. Okay, is that an intimate partner or an acquaintance? I don't really care. I think what matters is what access or information do they have and how committed do they seem to be to the course of conduct. And perhaps teens know that these intimate partner offenders are the most dangerous because when the study asked them of the offenders who's the scariest, it was their ex-partners. They were the most afraid when the stalking offender was a former boyfriend or girlfriend, likely due to that increased access and information. This was a study, it was adult women, all had been abused, all had protective orders, some were abused and stalked. The women abused and stalked had higher rates of all these forms of harm listed here, everything from verbal abuse to physical violence, sexual violence, attack with the weapon, and injury. And that homicide connection I mentioned right at the top today. Here's a more recent study reinforcing it. Stalking is a lethality risk within a dating violence relationship. It's one of the top 10 risk factors for intimate partner homicide. So look, I'm not saying stalking causes violence or stalking causes homicide, but I am saying it's an indicator that when you see stalking in a teen dating violence relationship, whether it's during and or after, that should be a red flag that, hey, this abuser might be particularly dangerous. This victim might be at risk for multiple forms of victimization. If we just call it emotional or digital abuse, we miss that red flag. Stalking can also intersect with sexual violence a few different ways. One's just to realize the co-occurrence here. Unfortunately, we don't have a similar study as this with our under 18s. But when we look at our young adults, 18 to 24, who identified as sexual assault survivors, simply asking them, have you experienced stalking? Nearly half are saying yes. And so we know this is happening at high rates, but not always being identified. This can happen a few different ways. Our stalker might be threatening to be sexually violent towards the victim, right? And so they're making sexual threats or they're planning sexual violence. They're seeing, when's this person alone? When are they vulnerable? When can I get them, when can I get to their house? They're trying to get a third party to assault the victim. So we see a lot of impersonation online. Perhaps the stalker creates a fake dating profile for the victim and says, hey, here's what I'm into. Then third parties are approaching that victim and the victim's like, I'm not even on that app, right? And so we see that increasingly. Of course, sexual assault can be any part of a stalker course of conduct, or sometimes the stalking begins with sexual violence and there's contact after where it becomes stalking. Either that you better not tell anyone, or I'll release these photos, or thanks for a great time when you're coming back, right? You get a case where an offender assaulted a victim using an object, then kept mailing that object, so that kind of reinforcing the trauma of the assault. Stalking can look really scary on its face, or it can look more like this kind of grooming behavior, right? This might come from another person of the same age or from an older person who might be looking at that young person and exploiting their vulnerability. And so those offenders are generally going to have the same MO. They're going to identify vulnerable victims. And unfortunately, being young is a kind of vulnerability, right? um Establish relationships. You seem really mature for your age. I think I really get you. Meet them in person if they haven't already, and isolate them. That might be, come to this college party, I'm gonna then ply that person with alcohol and isolate them and commit the assaults. It could be, hey, let's take some pictures at my house, I think you should be a model, right? um and then contact them after. And so if you think about this through the lens of stalking, it's a pattern of behavior. It's directed at a specific person, and it would cause fear because most of us are afraid of sexual violence. Now, you might be looking at this thinking, well, it doesn't look scary here, right? And your victim might say, well, yeah, when, they told me I seemed mature for my age, I was flattered, right? That was awesome. But there's no statute that says when fear has to attach. So if your victim's saying, yeah, at the time I liked that, but looking back, I realized the whole thing was a setup for my rape, and it started with that text message, that might still be a stalking case. So just another way to think about our grooming of young people as well, because often our offenders are doing this kind of surveillance, this research on who they perceive as vulnerable and not credible. This same study of women with protective orders found that not only did the women experience higher levels of rape itself, but all these other forms of sexual violence as well, including degradation. If you look at verbal pressure, it goes up, right? And so for substance use. And so stalking is an indicator of not only sexual assault, but other kinds of sexual violence as well. And this was undergraduates. About a third of our students stalked by an intimate partner, also sexually assaulted by that partner. And more than 1 in 10 stalked by an intimate partner were physically assaulted by that partner. And so we know these victimizations often intersect, and there's no reason to think they wouldn't at the teen age as well. Stalking is not only an indicator that our victim might be experiencing multiple forms of violence, but this one I thought really fascinating study. I'm biased, I like this stuff, but kind of found that stalking perpetration was also an indicator of perpetrating other kinds of violence. And so it separated boys and girls, and it looked basically this big list of stalking behaviors. And so teen girls who engaged in some of those stalking behaviors also had higher rates of all of these than girls who did not engage in stalking behaviors. So everything from peer violence, teacher violence, teen dating violence, and sexual violence, and weapon use. So if our girls were stalking, they were more likely to be doing these other things as well. Now, a little more complicated was the data on boys. Like I said, there was a big list of behaviors. And so some boys were doing some of those behaviors. Those are this one listed here under some. And then a small percentage, and it was only boys, were doing all of those behaviors. Those were the comprehensive perpetrators. So if you're not a big numbers person, that's fine. I'm not either. Basically, what you need to see here is the numbers go up, right? The numbers go up from no stalking to some stalking. We see higher rates of almost all of these kinds of violence. And now let's look at our comprehensive perpetrators. So they're engaging in every kind of stalking behavior. Wow, so high, right? So if someone is being a very committed stalker engaging in a variety of stalking behaviors, they're even more likely to engage in a variety of other kinds of violence against the victim and others, like peer violence, teacher violence, physically harming others, etc. So stalking is an indicator that our victim might be at additional risk, and our teens who stalk might be particularly dangerous as well. Again, not saying stalking's causing them to be violent, but rather that it's a red flag that this person might be um, perpetrating more violence. So long story short, too late maybe, ask about co-occurring victimizations. Absolutely ask your teen survivors who are primarily presenting as stalking victims about intimate partner and sexual violence, but also ask your teens who are identifying as sexual violence and or dating violence survivors about stalking, because so often that's in there as well, but it gets missed, and then we're not reacting to the full victimization. And that matters, right? It matters if we are going in a criminal justice direction for our charging and prosecution options. It matters for our safety planning. When we think about stalking, you want to be thinking, okay, surveillance, life invasion, etc. Maybe I'll use the stalking specific risk assessment. I'm going to note the higher rates of violence, or the higher likelihood that this victim might experience violence. We miss all that if we don't name it. And victim empowerment. Even if a victim's like, I don't want to do any of that. Like, I don't want to talk to, law enforcement. I don't want to talk to the school counselor. Even just to be able to say, I'm experiencing stalking instead of my ex is being creepy, and they can Google it and resources come up, goes a long way. Thing is, I hear the word stalking all the time used incorrectly, in this age group, but frankly among adults as well, probably at the same rate. And so you might have heard or said something like this, I'm totally stalking you and I saw your photos. And yes, you can use social media to stalk somebody, but that's probably not what's happening here, right? And I'm certainly not saying that the casual use of the word stalking causes stalking. It doesn't. But I do think it dilutes the seriousness of the term, because we're calling it stalking when it's not, and getting this idea of stalking is not that big a deal in our heads. And then folks aren't calling it stalking when it is. And it's a bit unique to this word at this point. I found that even in spaces that are pretty mindful about language, I still see stalking jokes persist. Um, and we know most victims tell family or friends first. No one says, oh man, that party was so lit. It's arson, right? If you tell your friend there was arson, they're going to be like, dude, there's arson? You okay? We got to call the police. Do your parents know about this? Right? There was arson. But if you tell your friend, I think it's stalking, you're likely to get this, like, is it stalking or is it stalking kind of response that can have a very chilling effect. And if our victim continues to seek help or services, we also see stalking romanticized, glorified, made fun of a variety of ways. I have a recorded webinar that goes into this in more detail, but I think the media literacy piece is a really fun way to engage young folks on stalking. But, long story short, it's often shown as romantic, where it's usually our male protagonist will stop at nothing to get the girl. Or it's shown as funny in our sitcoms and cartoons, where we have, SpongeBob's like this idiot who cannot take no for an answer, or he's always bothering Squidward, right? And it's played for laughs. We're not actually worried about anyone's safety. Or it's heroic, like Spider-Man's got to watch over the city so he can swoop in and save Mary Jane. Well, what do our offenders say? They say, I trust you. I don't trust the world around you. That's why I have to watch you to keep you safe. Or it's shown as edgy and sexy, right? Like, ooh, we went there, right? And I'm like, no, who else is going there? 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6 men, right? Now, of these, I like to see stalking in a horror movie. I'm like, yeah, it's scary. That is accurate. I think it's a lot more harmful when we show it as heroic, funny, or romantic. There's no one piece of media that's the problem. It's fine to like what you like, but the cumulative effect is that it creates a fantasy of stalking. And the fantasy version is that the stalker is someone attractive and likable who has good intentions. And we're supposed to feel at worst like, ugh, there they are again. And at best, very flattered and seen by this. And that's not the reality of stalking. Stalkers are people we know and don't want contact with, who are trying to scare us and are engaging in a variety of disturbing and violent behaviors. So I don't think there's any one reason for the minimization of stalking. But when I see folks saying, oh, it's just stalking, and really not addressing it in its complexity and urgency, I often think to myself, oh, you're responding to the fantasy of stalking, not the reality of stalking. Um, and it's fine to have that fantasy, but let's bring up that reality. And at this point, if you watch a show and there's an episode with, say, rape, usually something will come up at the end that's like, hey, if you're experiencing this, call this number. We don't have that for stalking. So we just have the misinformation and misrepresentation and no counterbalance of real information, right? And that's why it's so important for all of us to be reaching young people as accurate sources of information about here's what stalking really is and where to go for help. A couple of resources and ideas to help you do so. Anytime a student's talking about any upsetting behavior, again, zoom out. Is this isolated? Is this part of a bigger course of conduct? If they've shared that intimate image, did they also threaten to do it, and then gloat about it? That might be three behaviors, right? Or three contacts. And so let's think about that in a bigger context. We often want to recommend no contact with our stalkers, and that's because they see any contact as reinforcement. So if the stalker calls 50 times and the victim picks up and says, I hate you, tomorrow they're calling 51 times. That being said, that may not be possible or realistic for our victim. If our victim blocks the offender on everything, then maybe the offender can't see the victim can't see the offender either. So they're not going to get that text saying, hey, I'm back in town. When can I see you? So they know to leave. Or see on Instagram, oh, they're dating someone new. Maybe they'll calm down, right? And sometimes they might want to keep their enemies closer. That might be perfectly reasonable safety planning. A victim put it to me like this once. They're like, if you're being hunted by someone, don't you want to know where they are? Kind of hard to argue with that. So it's messier from a criminal justice perspective, but it also might be in the best interest of the victim's safety. So if you're thinking about no contact orders, a lot of them are mutual. Well, if you're looking at like the bottom of this screen, victims are getting this all day. The temptation to respond and say, stop it, is strong. It doesn't mean, oh, the contact was mutual. They're not scared, right? So we want to be thinking about that thoughtfully as well. Already mentioned documentation log, free on our website, very succinct, date, time, what happened, where, physical location, because often victims don't understand jurisdiction, right? And they don't know which officers are talking to each other or not. And if technology was used, what platform? Because getting evidence from Snapchat is different than Google, right? Is different than Instagram. And so we want to know that. The witness information, if they've attached any evidence and encouraging them to do so, and if they made a report to anyone. If it's law enforcement, great, get their name and badge number. But to a lot of victims, a badge is a badge. They don't know who's official law enforcement or not. So even if it turns out, oh no, that wasn't law enforcement, you told like security at the grocery store, or you told the bouncer at that club, right? That's still a good witness. And they were still scared enough to tell an authority figure. And even if they do call the same department every time, they might have a different responding officer. So by the time they get that call about there's a cup of coffee, they might roll their eyes. And so to be able to show this along with that sharp assessment narrative that I mentioned earlier and explain it quickly, look, it's burdensome for victims. It's unfair. It's a lot of work, but it's really helpful because these incidents add up, but they only add up if we do the math, right? And so something like this can really help with that. Of course, what we need most of all is that coordination, right? Our system is not set up for stalking cases. It's set up to be incident based. And the reality is, after this 90 minutes, you now know more about stalking than most people in our field. That is the reality of the situation. And so when I see stalking cases go wrong, it's often boils down to a lack of coordination and a lack of urgency. Different parties know different pieces of information. No one's connecting the dots, and no one's really seeing this and saying, we need to act now. And so it really has to be you in whatever role that you play saying, my partners may or may not get this, but I know better. And I know that this is actually quite urgent, and helping walk victims through our imperfect system, because if you don't, likely no one will. And we don't want to be losing victims of any age because of that. Couple more resources to help you out. Victim Connect's the closest thing we have to a stalking hotline. So if you're ever sharing RAIN or DV, you might want to share that as well. Stalking Awareness Month is in January. We really have everything you need on our website to make that happen easily, to table, to do a workshop, to send a newsletter, anything like that. We also have activities you can integrate into your awareness activities. I think I said activities twice, but you can go on our website. So if you don't have time for a standalone program, maybe there's an activity or something you can do and then discuss. So again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so here's an example of one, and we give you the full instructions for that. We also do have standalone public awareness workshops. Now, I'll grant you, these are developed for college students, but I think they could be pretty easily adapted for our high school students. And if you want examples of student cases, then I'm happy to send those to you. Just reach out to me. Discussion guides on all 4 seasons of You. We also share on social media, like right now, everyone's talking baby reindeer. So we have some posts about that. So we try to engage with media to talk about that. Infographics. And so, use these year round. It's about to be Pride Month. So if you're talking about issues affecting LGBTQ students, well, maybe include some information on stalking as well, right? So don't make it stalking one and done. Incorporate that year round into a variety of topics and programs. Mention these at the top. These are free on our website. We have them in English and Spanish now. So nice way to have some kind of passive awareness building. And speaking of our website, you know it, you love it, stalkingawareness.org. Where we have all the things I mentioned that Emma's been linking to. So thank you, Emma, as well as more. You can also request additional training there in person or online. We're usually free of charge, and we like to say yes. And so please do reach out to us. Here's my contact information. I just want to thank you so much for your attention and for all of your good work. I know it's easy for me to sit here and say, hey, think about this. Here's another issue facing our teens, consider that. But you're the ones actually on the ground, keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. It is all easier said than done. And I understand and appreciate that. So truly thank you for the work that you do, and don't hesitate to reach out if we can help you do it in any way. So with that, I know our interpreters might have to go because I went overtime. Thank you, interpreters. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A, so I will go to those unless they tell me I can't, in which case feel free to email me your questions. Okay, great. Someone asked about videos or interactive activities. Yes, we'd have those all over our website. And yeah, if you're doing any programs with teens and you would just like a set of eyes on it, how could I better incorporate stalking, etc., let me know. I'm happy to take a look at it and give you my hot takes at any time. Someone asked for recommendations about books, documentaries, movies about stalking. There aren't a lot that are accurate on their own that don't sensationalize this in any way. I think that you can media, depending on the age and maturity of your audience, like for example, like Baby Reindeer says a lot of accurate things about stalking, but it's also a unique story in some ways, just like every survivor story is unique. So I wouldn't be like, well, just watch that, now you know stalking. But I do think that can be a good starting place for discussion, right? If you put that in context. So yeah, there's some I like better than others. I've got opinions on everything. But there's not tons of literature that's about understanding stalking. I hate to, toot our own horn here, but I'd honestly say watch our short videos on our website. We have new e-learning modules as well, that I'm biased, but I think they're pretty fun. They're short, that explain stalking. And so that's there's so few resources that honestly, that's a good place to go. And then we also link on external resources to other places that have good information. So I hope that's helpful. I wish I had better recommendations for you. Okay, I think that is it. I got it. The only thing I wanted to add, even though I'm way over time, and I was like, I meant to say this, is just to recognize that, with teens, norms change. I think, norm around technology can change. It's easy to say, well, teens are sharing passwords and that's bad. I don't think that's that helpful. I think what doesn't change is that there is abuse, there is stalking, and there are offenders pushing on victims' boundaries, and victims are afraid to assert those boundaries, trust their instincts, and push back. And so rather than this norm is good or bad, I think it's better to talk about what are the pros and cons of this? What are you comfortable doing? How are you communicating that? And do you feel safe? And how do you trust your instincts when you feel like someone's making you uncomfortable? Because that's universal. And too often, I think this can get into a judging space, and I'm generalizing, but generationally, where at the risk of sounding too twee, but like, what did you share kind of becomes the new what did you wear, right? And I don't think that's helpful. And so easier said than done for sure, but I hope that that informs your response a little bit as well. So those bonus hot takes for people who stuck around. So thank you. But with that being said, I know I'm over time. So thank you all so much and keep in touch.